Welcome back to True Law Stories. I'm Garlic here, and today we're going to talk with my friend, a local, amazing federal criminal defense attorney, a ton of history, former federal prosecutor, and the founder of Horwitz Citro law firm, Mark Horwitz. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you, Ian. It's my pleasure. Good to see you again.
Always a pleasure to see you. Mark's an awesome guy. I mean, incredible attorney. Google his name, you'll find tons of cases that he's tried both as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney. But before we get started, and you're going to tell a couple stories, very emotional stories, one about a kidnapping and one about a trial of a husband and wife. But let's talk a little bit about your background first. I mean, because you have a very interesting background. How did you get into law?
Well, how I got into law was as a youngster visiting with my uncle, who was a lawyer. He's now passed. He was a lawyer in Lake Worth, Florida. He was the last lawyer among the last year that a lawyer could become a member of the bar by graduating from a Florida law school, which at the time there were only 3. So those days are gone. Now you got to take the bar exam. But just I would visit with him on occasion through growing up, and kind of got in my mind. It looked interesting, and that's what I wanted to do. So I went to UF and got a bachelor's degree in business administration and went to law school there.
And then you went to work for the U.S. government. How was that as a federal prosecutor?
Yes, it was very. I enjoyed every day. Let's put it that way. It was an awesome experience. I kind of fell into the job coming off active duty in the Army, and wound up being assigned to the office in Orlando, Florida. Although I did try cases in Tampa for the federal government and in Jacksonville. So it was. Like I said, I enjoyed every day of it. It's a lot of responsibility. You feel like you're representing the United States of America. That's a big responsibility. And after I left, I went into that. I went into criminal defense, and I still believe that in the Constitution, and I have a responsibility to my clients to make sure that they get the effective representation, especially when you see your name on an indictment that says United States of America versus. If that doesn't get you nervous, nothing will.
Oh, yeah. That's scary to say the least. And over the years, you've seen a lot, obviously, ups and downs. And, let's get into the story. So you were telling about a kidnapping story that happened while you were a prosecutor. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was. I'm going to tell you the facts of the case. Generally, the case was it was a kidnapping of a 5-year-old girl who the family, which consisted of the mother and the father and their daughter, were coming down on vacation and staying at a Daytona Beach motel and so actually they could walk out of the hotel and there they were on the beach. So the young girl was kidnapped, and then we had a trial. So I'm going to relate to you the facts as I learned them, a little bit behind the scenes information. And the case was probably the most emotional trial that I've ever been involved with. And at the same time, that was half the trial. The other half of the trial was the technical issues involved because the defendant claimed insanity as his defense. So what I'm going to tell you now is the evidence that came out at the trial. The family pulled up the father was driving, pulled into the hotel, the hotel on the ocean, got out of the car, summer day, still warm, left the engine running with his wife in the front passenger seat, the daughter in the back. He goes into the hotel. As fate would have it, a guy who had just gotten out of prison about 3 or 4 weeks before then comes across and sees the car running jumps into the car and opens the door and pushes the mother out of the car. She is barefooted, but her daughter is still in the back seat. At which point he starts to drive away, and the mother starts running after him with no shoes on, late mid-afternoon, burning her feet, screaming, "Just give me my baby. Just give me my baby back." Gone.
Ugh.
I then got a call later that day from the FBI, an FBI agent who had been assigned this matter in Daytona Beach. The normal procedure would be that 24 hours has to go by to make the assumption that there was a crossing of a state line. And this agent had dealt with me and some of the other lawyers in the office and tried to get a warrant to get the feds involved as early as possible. And the assistant refused because the 24 hours hadn't passed. This is an example of me violating the policy, but I said, "Come on over, you're going to get your warrant." So we got the warrant, and he came in, we filled out the complaint, unknown defendant, and it's proceeded. I told him, "Go ahead, you got it." So that's a little aside. And then, of course, this went out. It was national news, very emotional. It was on the news, and it just so happened, I think it was 3 days later, in Charleston, South Carolina, the shift comes in, the morning shift, and they get a briefing. The police get a briefing of what's new. What do you look out for? And that shift is sitting there, and the sergeant comes in, and apparently he had not seen it the day before. He comes in and says, "Be on the lookout for a kidnapped victim, a 5-year-old girl." And she was in the car, and they had, of course, the description of the car and the license plate on the car. The cops go out. They are on their job, and lo and behold, one of the policemen in the briefing comes up to a red light and notices the car in front of him is the car. And he notices a driver and a little girl in the back. He gets out of his car, the light's still red. He's parked right behind the kidnapped victim and the car. He walks over to the driver's side, taps on the window, and makes a motion to roll the window down, lower the window. The driver, the defendant, ultimately the defendant in the case, looks at him and speeds off. That's significant. Thereafter, a high-speed chase through the streets of Charleston occurs. And ultimately, the kidnapper takes a wrong turn, meaning he goes into an alley. So one of the other police officers blocks the exit to the alley, and the chasing officer is behind him. He's trapped. So the kidnapper gets to the end of the alley, and he can't get any further because the other police car is blocking his exit straight ahead. That police officer jumped out of his car when he saw him coming, jumps onto the hood, has his pistol pointed right at the head of the kidnapper. Meanwhile, the second officer comes up behind the car, gets right behind it, puts his car in park, jumps out of the car, runs over to the side where the little girl is, knocks on the window and points to the lock. and this is as the explained by, as testified by the officer. Both hands, she lifts the lock. He opens the door. He reaches for her. She jumps into his arms, screaming, "Save me, save me, save me." When I interviewed the officer, and when he came down to Orlando for the trial, he broke out crying. I teared up, and it was so emotional. So just like that, this unsolved case is solved, and the little girl was not harmed. And when I told that story, which was what the evidence would show to the jury, my memory is 4 or 5 of them were shedding a tear. When the mother testified, you can imagine what she went through. The emotion level was hard to describe. But again, there was a lot of tears shed during that trial. And the little girl who reminded me, and I'm showing my age now, if you ever seen old Shirley Temple movies, reminded me of a little Shirley Temple when she was a little kid. And to the point where I think she was just turned 5. She didn't know the difference between right or left. Which
Yeah.
And so the father, who brought his daughter into the courtroom when it was her time to testify, we understood that she didn't know right from left. So I said, well, but the clerk is going to say, raise your right hand to tell the truth. And so I told the father, just make sure you're holding her left hand when you bring her in the So he did, and we spent a lot of time with her, and she told her story, and the judge was satisfied that she knew the difference between truth and a lie. So then the second part of the case was the defense of insanity. Now, that defense was disclosed long before the trial. And as a result of that disclosure, I filed a motion with the court asking, of course, the defendant was in custody at the time since his arrest. He had not been released on bond. I made a motion to have the court authorize me to send him to a federal prison that had a mental facility. It was also a hospital, and for 90 days of observation and analysis. So that happened. He was sent off there. 90 plus days go by, he comes back. And for the trial, I bring the psychologist down who was on the team that was evaluating him. To testify after the defense put on its case, we would have rebuttal through the government's expert. And that's how it went. The defense had him see a very well-respected psychologist in Central Florida who went to the jail and spent about 90 minutes with him and said that he met the definition of being legally insane. So in relation to my cross-examination of the defense expert, I zeroed in on certain factors. One was, how much time did he have to spend with the defendant? He said 90 minutes, compared to my expert who spent 90 days.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was one big difference. Another was that through to my government psychologist, we went over the tests that the psychologist for the defense had given. And he pointed out to me that man could not possibly have given all the tests. The psychologist could not have used all the tests as they were required to use, the full test, because you couldn't do them in 5 hours, never mind 90 minutes. So that was one of my methods of cross-examining. I had the doc, because that wasn't in his report. He had to admit that, yeah, this test takes 2 hours, and I spent 25 minutes on it, So went through each of the tests that he gave, showing clearly that he didn't give the full test. And then that I thought was discrediting to his opinion. And then I brought back certain things that happened during the arrest. I said, well, and basically he didn't know the difference between right and wrong and couldn't conform to right. Well, the difference between right and wrong. So I asked a question, this is not verbatim, but basically, so what is it your testimony that when the police officer walked up to the defendant and asked him to roll down the window, looking at the police officer's uniform, and instead of rolling down the window, he sped off and engaged in a high-speed chase? Do you think he didn't know that what he was doing was wrong when he ran away from the police officer? Now, what's he going to say to that? If he says yes, he knew, then that deflates the value of his testimony. If he says no, he didn't know, who's going to believe him? Why do you run away from a police officer if you don't think you're doing something wrong? So that's how that went. And ultimately, it went to the jury. And again, there were a lot of teary eyes going over the first part of the case about what this family went through, and everybody imagining the horror of chasing a car with your daughter in the back seat, just screaming, "Give me my baby." Oh. Amazing. And he was convicted. So,
and who was the psychologist, if you don't mind me asking?
I'd rather not say.
Okay. No, that's all right. That's all right. I gotcha.
I can tell you this. He wrote a book, and he said that cross-examination was the worst he's ever been in.
The reason I'm asking is because I took some forensic psychology classes here in Central Florida, and I'm wondering if he was my professor because he was well known. We can talk about that off the record. How often how often is that used? The insanity defense.
I don't keep statistics on it. It's a tough defense. And it really, like all cases, the evidence is there. It's not there. And sometimes it's hard, even if somebody is mentally off, that doesn't mean they meet the definition of insanity. And in a federal court, if you don't know the difference between right and wrong, or if you do know, you can't confirm your conduct, you just can't follow what is required, even though you know it's required. And so, it's a tough defense because, people, it's subject to being abused, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
And so, and how was it to switch over from being a prosecutor and obviously being a fervent prosecutor and, going after people like this to being on the other side and defending people?
I get asked that on occasion. And the answer is, as a government lawyer, I believed I had a client, and that client was the United States of America. And I believe in the justice system in this country, which requires that the defendant and the government have good, competent, ethical lawyers. And that's how I conducted myself. And when I left and started representing people, I felt the same way. I am as much a part of the justice system as I was as a prosecutor. I tried many cases. Every case that I tried, I believed that the police were telling me the truth. On a very rare occasion that I can count on one hand, I caught an agent lying to me, and I killed the case, and I said, "Don't come back to me. Ask me to prosecute a case that you have anything to do with." But when I went to the other side, I also know that people make mistakes. As a prosecutor, I felt confident that I had a good case and I could prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. I was never motivated by other factors, although I've seen on the news over the years that sometimes other factors come into it. publicity, promotion, whatever. And the other part of it is, and that needs to be fought. But the other part of it is, law enforcement officers and prosecutors are like everybody else. They make mistakes. They can make mistakes. I'm not saying they make mistakes all the time, but they can make mistakes. And when those mistakes are made, if defense counsel doesn't do what the defense counsel needs to do, that is effective, knowledgeable representation, our system doesn't work. So, that's the reality of it, and I've always believed it. Now, I've had represented people that sometimes a case is not, a trial is a waste of time because the evidence is overwhelming. But that's not the end of the story, because especially in the federal system, the sentences are outrageous. And as a result of that, you have to understand that if the evidence is not there, and I believe in trying a case if there is a triable issue. There's some weakness in the government's case that if the jury believes, you get a not guilty verdict. But if that doesn't exist, and sometimes it doesn't, then even if you go to trial and lose or you plead guilty, it's damage control. Would you rather spend 30 years in prison or 5 years in prison? That's a big difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
it's a huge difference.
Yeah, and I've had that. I had that in numerous cases where pretty much every tax case that my clients have followed, criminal tax case in which they followed my advice, some I've gotten probation over vigorous objection by the government, other times, but I can also say that I've not had a case in which the government got what they asked for in a case in which the client had followed my advice. So it's meaning they got a lesser sentence.
Yeah. And you were going to talk about a husband and wife that were, pretty much law-abiding citizens, correct? And then got in some trouble.
Yes. I represented a couple, a husband and wife, who were under investigation by the Internal Revenue Service criminal agents. And that investigation centered around their business. They had a very successful retail business. And they came to me, and IRS criminal agents are very thorough. Their cases take a long time to develop. And by a long time, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Now, that doesn't mean it's constant during that time period. It's not, but their activity, they get active, then they wind up doing something else, and they come back to it. So literally, it takes a long time. Well, these people have been under investigation, as I recall, in excess of 3 years, going on 4 years, in Tampa, and they had a lawyer who I know was a good lawyer, and he had worked a deal whereby if the husband pled guilty and they were in the business together, the wife would not be charged. And that's not uncommon in relation to dealing with the federal government. And so that was, they came to me, they told me about what was going on and what the investigation was and what the deal was. And I said to him, I'm not going to get you a better deal than that. So you don't need to change lawyers. If you want to go to trial, call me. And they did. They called and they said, we've decided to go to trial. And so the tax cases are somewhat complex. And in this particular, one of the things that happens is the government basically will they have to prove that there was tax due, right? There was, for a tax evasion case, and that's what they usually do. They're usually not going to prosecute somebody for tax evasion if there's no tax due. So that's what they were doing. And they had, according to the government, obtained every bank record, every financial record available they had. And they needed to do that because they were recreating income. And the contention was that income was unreported. So that's where we started from. And then during the course of a case, the defense is provided with all of the exhibits that the government intends to use. One of the things that and the government always has in these cases, two different agents working with the prosecutor. One is the criminal agent, who often called the case agent, and the other is a revenue agent, that is a non-criminal employee, a non-criminal agent, like if you get an audit, right? And that person comes up with the numbers. And the numbers meaning this is the undisclosed income, this is the tax consequence, underpayment of tax. And so we had received, prior to trial, they said all of the exhibits, all of the documents concerning my client that had been obtained by the government, including, according to them, every bank transaction they've had over the last 5 years.
Wow.
And so I deal with an experienced forensic accountant who in the past was a revenue officer, that is a civil agent, and then was a criminal agent for the IRS. And I hire her as my accountant to assist in analysis of what the IRS is doing. So I make numerous requests, and I am told that I have all the records. For some reason, I don't have 3 months worth of bank account records. And, one of the issues is, let's say you have money going into the bank. If that money is from a non-taxable source, like a gift or a loan or transfer from one account to the other, that puts a big hole, and they don't have that information, the government doesn't have it, it puts a big hole in their case. So when we started the trial, and I kept asking for it, and they say, you got it, you got it, you got it. Okay, so we start the trial, and they call the criminal agent who went out and got all the records, right? And so he talks on direct, he testifies by answering the government lawyer's questions, and basically I have it all. It's all here. So on cross-examination, now this is, I think, the third day, fourth day into the trial. I start my cross and go into how careful he was and how he made sure he got all the records and how he needed the records in order to compute the actual, so that the revenue officer could compute the income correctly and the tax. So then I said, okay, well, would you get me this month, and this month from that account? He said, no problem. You want it now? I said, yeah, I want it now. Your Honor, may you step down from the bench and find it? He spent an agonizing 40 minutes looking for it.
Oh my gosh.
That's a long time with a jury staring.
Yeah.
At which point he says, I can't find it. The government lawyer stands up and asks for a recess. And he comes back an hour later saying, can we continue this case till tomorrow or the next day? So the case is continued. And the next day I get another summary that's from the IRS as to the amount of unreported income and the tax. And it's been changed. And it's been changed by the fact that the amount of tax is now lowered. Now, this is that they've been working on it for 4 years, right? Mm-hmm. And so then the agent comes back, and the agent has to admit that he doesn't have them. He has no indication that he ever had them. And he had to admit that he needed that to conduct the thorough investigation. And an accurate conclusion as to tax. So then there was a couple other witnesses. And the next day I got another summary by the revenue officer, again, lowering the tax. The next day, he starts on direct. When they finally get to the revenue officer, he's going on direct. And I think he spent a day and a half on direct, and I started on cross. And we ended the day. And before the next day started, I got another summary, again, lowering the tax. That happened one more time. I took a day and a half or 2 days on cross-examination, and I went over with him the reason why he changed. When he did the first one, he thought it was right. He changed the second one. He changed because the third one he changed, and the fourth one. I said, and you changed these 4 changes that you've made are as a result of your answering my questions on cross-examination and the cross-examination of some of the other witnesses. He had to say yes.
Oh.
So then this case was in Tampa. We're driving back to Orlando with my accountant, and I said to her, they're going to come up with something else. You know it. They're going to come up with something else. And so I said to her, you got to find. And my goodness, the next day driving back, she said, this is what they're going to say. So he did. And I got another summary, which again lowered the tax. But still, it was enough to, if they believe it, to get a conviction. So.
And what kind of conviction were they facing at the beginning of it? And, what, as far as like time in prison, what could happen to them?
Oh, there was each count, and I believe there were 2 counts, 2 years, was up to 5 years in prison. So that's looking at 10 years.
Wow.
And when you got kids that are 6, 7, 8, and both parents in prison.
Yeah, that's scary.
That's scary. And so the way I ended the cross-examination after debunking the other change that he had, I said, so it would be fair to say that, and I went through each of the 5 changes, okay? I said, would it be fair to say that you have created this last and final summary of the tax deficiency and the unreported income with the same care and attention to detail as you did the first 4 that you gave us? And he said yes. So the jury went out and deliberated with not guilty.
Wow.
And this was probably the most emotional verdict I've seen by my client, the husband, who was not only under the pressure of himself going to prison, but knowing that he could have taken a deal and his wife could have stayed around and raised the kids, right? He dropped to his knees in that courtroom praying and thanking God. And it was so touching.
I can imagine.
And it just so happened that I probably about three years ago, and this case was many years before then, I was at a function in the federal courthouse where we were swearing in one of the new federal magistrates, and the federal judge who tried that case that I've just described was there afterwards, while we were having hors d'oeuvres and refreshments after the ceremony. And he said, I still remember that verdict. And it was still the most emotional verdict I've ever seen. And so even though the case itself was basically a boring numbers case, because of the errors in the IRS agents and the civil and criminal in their work product, the result was a not guilty verdicts for both. And I like to say that I leave no stone unturned in defending a client, just like I left no stone unturned representing the United States. And you just, if the lawyer doesn't do that and hadn't found what I found, they would have been convicted.
Yeah. Oh.
So finding it and then knowing how to use it, like, is this prepared with the same care and attention to detail as you did in your first four?
Yeah.
What's the answer to that? There is no good answer from him on that.
And yeah, I mean, both these cases too, it's asking the right questions. It's not just knowing the information, it's how you present it, isn't it?
Right.
And that's interesting. And how did you feel after that?
Well, you don't like to lose any case as a lawyer. I mean, so I felt like I had a chance to win this. So I felt good about the win. And even more than that, I felt that my clients got the justice that they deserved, and their family wasn't ruined. And to me, that's the best of all, when I help somebody like that.
Yeah. And I mean, because we see these cases that, people are being tried. And I think a lot of times we see cases where, most of the time it's the person's pretty obviously guilty and it's a bad person. And that's what we see on TV. And that's why I like these stories, because you don't realize how many people you're protecting who are good people that just happen to be in the bad place. It happens a lot, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, exactly how many times, who knows? But those things do happen. And you get into complex white collar cases. Some of them are slam dunks. Some of them, the evidence is overwhelming. But others, they may think the evidence is overwhelming, but only because they haven't really looked at what they've got and done a thorough investigation.
And well, that's amazing. And you do great work. I mean, these were fantastic stories. Mark, I really appreciate you being on and telling these stories for us.
Well, it's my pleasure. And, there's sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.
Well, that's exactly it. Exactly it. Some of these that you write these and people wouldn't believe them if they weren't true stories. They wouldn't make good movies because it's too crazy. And if anyone, hopefully none of you ever need an attorney, but if you do need an attorney, you can go to HorwitzCitrolaw.com. Mark and Vince will also be on, our fantastic attorneys, fantastic people. Obviously work very hard and are very professional and are well known in the legal community as some of the best out there. But Mark, thank you very much for being on True Law Stories. My pleasure. And it's good seeing you again. It's good. Always a pleasure to see you too. And thank you all for letting Mark take you on his journey. This has been Iron Garlic and True Law Stories.